Christina Avila. I'm a senior undergraduate student in the Mexican American Studies program. The majority of my work centers on the intersections of social locations such as race, class, gender, and sexuality. Although women and gender diverse folks of color have made strides in rap and hip hop genres in recent decades, I have found that they are largely left out of the historical narrative. This podcast provides a great opportunity for me to explore the rich history of women and LGBTQIA+ folks in hip hop and to investigate some of the reasons they are sadly not more prominent within the broader cultural zeitgeist.
My name is Jody Salazar, and I am a graduate student in Mexican American Studies Interdisciplinary. My previous work is in the Black Historical Studies realm and the continuity of Black culture. This investigation allows me to explore ideas of collective social experiences and how that information is shared and has been shared over time. More specifically, I am interested in the continuity of cultural artistry and practices. This project has allowed me to view hip-hop and its birth in the 70s and early 80s as a culmination of artistic aesthetics tracing all the way back to the African continent.
Hi, my name is Alejandra Mezcua, and I am also a graduate student in the Mexican American Studies program Interdisciplinary. Overall, this project has encouraged me to reflect on our own community in the Rio Grande Valley and the forms of expression specifically from local artists who use their creative freedom to express their identity and beliefs, reflecting on the emergence of graffiti in the Bronx and how we can make the connection to the Rio Grande Valley. I immediately thought about a local artist by the name Uriel Monderos, which we will be talking about as a roundtable at the end of our podcast.
While hip-hop is said to have begun in the US, the Bronx to be exact, the origins of hip-hop can be traced throughout the African diaspora. The identifying elements of hip-hop, emceeing, DJing, b-boying or b-girling, and graffiti are rooted in collective practices with a much longer and broader history. These practices center around storytelling and histories which are both for and about the community.
An MC calls to the people, sharing the stories, hyping the crowd to respond. A DJ often does the inventive work of using found objects in innovative and often repeated ways. With hip-hop, that often involves digging through record bins and tracks to create something new and different. Dance is as expressive as vocal and instrumental elements of music, if not more so. B-boys and B-girls use their whole bodies to tell stories. The dancer may dance alone, but they join in the circle, taking center stage, showing off their abilities, and then allow the next dancer to do the same.
Graffiti represents a form of activism as an act of resistance and response to injustices and marginalization. The elements of hip-hop often involve one person acting alone, but speaking for the community and to the crowd, making the experience a social collective.
When viewed through the lens of the African diaspora, hip-hop is griots, spirituals and ring shouts, work songs and the blues, Motown, soul, and funk. Each of these is an historical step into the circle, gathered collectively in shared experiences. If hip-hop is a social collective of musical commentary on shared experiences and storytelling amplified by MCs, DJs, dancers, and artistic expression, its roots are long and spread across continents. The roles may have different names, but ultimately the heart of hip-hop remains constant. Share the stories of the people and your community using your art and talent to do so. The making and sharing of art is an act of resistance and solidarity, commentary, and community. Throughout the African diaspora, we see evidence of the Congo cosmogram, the world and our existence in it as circular, without end, continuous. This is evidenced by principles such as the Akan proverb, Sankofa, the literal translation being, go back and fetch it, or journey to the past to retrieve that which was lost or silenced, bring it with you into the present, and use it to shape the future. Griots are West African storytellers who use song to share stories and histories of the people. In That's the Joint, a chapter called Bring It to the Cipher, H. Sami Alim shares this quote from Cheryl Keys in Folklore Forum. We know that rapping in and of itself is not entirely new. Rather, it is the most modern, postmodern instantiation of linguistic cultural practices of Africans in America. Sounds like an MC, doesn't it? Spirituals and ring shouts go hand in hand. From the Library of Congress. The forum has its roots in the informal gatherings of African slaves in praise houses and outdoor meetings called brush arbor meetings, bush meetings, or camp meetings in the 18th century. At the meetings, participants would sing, chant, dance, and sometimes enter ecstatic trances. Spirituals also stem from the ring shout, a shuffling, circular dance, to chanting and hand clapping that was common among early plantation slaves. These both feature call and response style interaction with the other participants in the audience. Also in the chapter, Bring It to the Cipher, H. Samuel Eames shares this definition of call and response. Shot through with action and interaction, Black communicative performance is concentric in quality, the audience becoming both observers and participants in the speech event. Sounds like the house parties filled with b-boys and b-girls in the Bronx with an MC calling the crowd and the crowd responding, doesn't it? Work songs have been known by many names: field hollers, field calls, street calls, and work songs, amongst many others. These songs served many practical purposes, such as organizing the laborers into a rhythmic pattern of working together in unison and calls for water and food. Yet, at their roots are songs built on protest and shared experiences, often experiences of suffering. These glimpses into the world of poverty and oppression, although sometimes criticized for their harsh depictions of life, are honest and visceral. Songs about crime, loss, relationships, and regrets are ultimately stories of humanity that others can relate to. There was one recurring character in work songs, which even crossed over into the blues as well. Jody is the one who steals your wife and life while you're gone away working, imprisoned, and otherwise occupied. Gonna settle down for the rest of my life, yeah, 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 yeah. Get myself a job and get myself a wife, yeah, 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 yeah. 6 long years I've been in the pen, yeah, 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 yeah. Don't want to come to this place again, yeah, 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 yeah. Captain and the boss is driving us on, yeah, 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 yeah. Making us wish we'd have stayed at home, yeah, 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 yeah. If we had listened what our mama say, yeah, 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 yeah. And this 1970 hit blues song by Johnny Taylor, who tells us, every guy I know trying to get ahead, working 2 jobs till you're almost dead. You tell 'em, work your fingers right down to the bone, there's a cat named Jody sneaking around in your home. Jody even makes an appearance in hip-hop lyrics later on, this time as a female in a song called Jodette by TK Soul. By the late 1970s and early 80s, Black artists were at the forefront of many musical styles: Motown, soul, and funk, just to name a few. This music built upon and grew out of many previous musical genres, including jazz, which has not been examined in this piece purely because the route from jazz to hip-hop could be an independent examination all its own. Music was expanding and growing, spreading from genre to genre at an incredible rate during this era. Artists such as Stevie Wonder were also borrowing from African artists such as Fela Kuti, making musical connections across continents and cultures. James Brown and Rick James, Diana Ross and Donna Summer, and many others laid the groundwork for musical styles the rising hip-hop artists could reinvent and make their own. Go back and fetch it. Hip-hop took the artistic building blocks from the past and brought them to the present to form a musical style which has lasted generations. The call echoes across a millennia, and the youth of the Bronx responded, and in turn sent a call out to audiences and listeners of hip-hop to respond. The circle continues, bridging communities, sharing in their arts and collective experience.
The nuances of identity, personal expression, and lived experience by people of color that have always been prevalent throughout popular culture are no strangers to the world of hip-hop. Although often considered problematic, regressive, or discriminatory towards marginalized folks, particularly those in the LGBTQIA+ communities, hip-hop has always been a site of subversion from the mainstream, and as a result has provided a space for the subaltern to thrive. In their chapter, "I'ma School That Bitch," Kristen Zemke and Jared Mackley Crump argue how complex and confronting topics such as no homo, the DL or down low, pronouns, trans, genderqueer, drag, homophobia, black masculinity, the commodification of black bodies, homoeroticism, twerking, bounce, and queens have always been a part of hip-hop culture, even if they haven't always been visible or at the forefront. Using a Butlerian/Foucauldian model of performativity and social constructionism, the authors view sexuality and gender as two of a number of identity continuums governed by historical, cultural, and social frameworks that are constantly in flux and deserving of analysis through a lens that allows room for the ebb and flow of said continuums. How does this translate to themes of identity and self-expression in hip-hop? It is imperative to situate the evolution of representation and inclusion of diverse voices within the context of the language and understandings of identity that were available at the time. Ma Rainey, born Gertrude Pridgett sometime between 1882 and 1886 in or around Columbus, Georgia, was a pioneer of blues sound and an openly bisexual woman who is considered by many to be the mother of blues. Blues has origins in call and response storytellings of West Africa and was passed down orally amongst generations of enslaved Africans. Ma Rainey's unique sound and powerful stage presence quickly catapulted her to popularity in local clubs and speakeasies throughout the country, though she would not receive widespread fame until decades after her death. Rainey was also notable for mentoring other prominent artists in the blues scene, such as Bessie Smith, with whom it was believed she had an ongoing romantic relationship. It should be noted that extreme caution must be taken when attempting to label historic figures' sexual orientation and/or gender identity, as the frameworks and understandings of identity we use today were not as clearly defined or even conceptualized at the time. Though many mainstream accounts of Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith may gloss over the extent of their relationship, scholars have recently analyzed their dynamic through a queer feminist lens, particularly the use of the term BD woman, a masculine-presenting lesbian. A black BD woman was an identity that emerged in the 1940s and is defined as a multi-layered response to sexism, racism, and homophobia that, quote, stole both masculinity and white privilege to accumulate power and cultural capital. Though this identity wouldn't become popularized until much later, both Rainey and Smith performed facets of this identity throughout their careers and made a lasting impression on future themes of identity, sexuality, and expression. Their subversion of heteronormative roles for women at the time also situate them as prominent pioneers of cultural representation. Social and economic factors during the early 20th century were integral for creating conditions that allowed for women to garner independence and autonomy and to begin to make a name for themselves in the entertainment industry. This freedom, however, did not make women, particularly women who did not ascribe to traditional expressions of femininity, immune to the still overwhelming reach of sexism and racism of the era. While subverting gender norms and using what small bits of influence they did have allowed BD women to gain traction in jazz and blues scenes in the 1920s and 30s, by the late 1930s, they faced backlash for being too masculine and threatening the authority of black men. This double-edged sword gave way to the rise of the sapphire caricature, a minstrel-derived stereotype that portrayed black women as domineering, rude, loud, and a threat to black male masculinity that ultimately dampened the rise of the BD woman's success in music. Jumping ahead slightly in the historical timeline to the late 1970s and early 1980s, another subculture that was evolving around the same time as hip-hop was the ballroom scene. Most widely known as a precursor to drag culture, ballroom, or just ball culture, was an underground, high-energy, LGBTQ+, Black and Latinx-led dance and performance subculture with roots dating back to the Harlem Renaissance, drag balls. Though ballroom culture is most often associated with New York City, there were also pockets across the U.S. in other cities, including New Orleans, D.C., Chicago, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, where culture was created and where queer and trans folks escaped in order to live authentically and find community. The scene was comprised of various rival houses led by a house mother, often an elder or more established and experienced member of the community, who often took in younger performers and gave them a safe space to live and perfect their persona. The houses would then use these personas to perform and compete against each other in clubs. The most glamorous, talented, or audacious performer would be crowned the winner and receive anything from bragging rights for their house to cash prizes as compensation. Though competition and stakes were always high at these events, the racially integrated and gender-inclusive spaces that ball culture occupied were always sites of community building and safety. Though hip-hop and ball may seem unrelated in terms of content and identity, they have much more in common than many realize. The themes of community, found family, advancing opportunities for marginalized folks, and promoting the arts through cultural production are all commonalities between the two. Ball was highly influential to lasting trends that are still prevalent in hip-hop culture and vice versa. Popular terms such as voguing, mother, and strike a pose originated in ballroom scenes, but have since been co-opted by mainstream artists such as Madonna and Beyoncé, who are unfortunately often credited with inventing them. In a 2024 interview, fashion designer Boris Powell argued the importance of knowing the history of these terms and trends and sharing them with the younger generations so that these histories are not erased. The reach and impact of early pioneers of LGBTQIA+ culture can clearly be seen in contemporary hip-hop and rap scenes. Artists such as Doechii, Snow the Product, Street Queens, Mickey Blanco, and Omar Apollo are just a few queer artists of color who are subverting gender norms and opening the door for even more discourse surrounding diversity and inclusion in the music industry. Jayla Hickman, better known by the mononym Doechii, is a queer rapper and hip-hop artist from Tampa, Florida. Though she recently gained worldwide acclaim following her 2025 Grammy win for Best Rap Album, she has been writing and producing music for over a decade. Initially releasing her tracks on YouTube and SoundCloud, she gained popularity in 2021 after going viral on TikTok. Despite her meteoric rise to fame, the foundation she has built as an artist are evident in everything she does. Definitely check out her Tiny Desk performance if you haven't already. Like the ballroom queens and BD women before her, Doechii similarly incorporates aspects of her identity, such as her queerness and her dark skin, as assets to be celebrated rather than shortcomings to be hidden or overcome. In an industry still warped by colorism, class inequity, and LGBTQIA+ discrimination, Doechii uses her background and identity to speak truth to power and to inspire others to do the same. The intentionality and artistry that queer and trans hip-hop artists evoke in their performances, the honesty they bring to their personas, and the conviction with which they advocate for their beliefs make for artists that will long be revered for both their talents and their commitments to paving the way for other diverse voices.
So, as we reflect on the book by Jeff Chang, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of Hip-Hop Generation, there are actually a lot of similarities between what Chang describes as graffiti and Urie's approach in his early work. As mentioned earlier, we will be talking about Urie Landeros, a local artist from the Rio Grande Valley. A little bit of context about his upbringing and background. He was born in Edinburgh, Texas in 1990. He is a multidisciplinary artist, but he is also an activist, a painter, muralist, photographer, and a social sculptor. His style is connected to graffiti counterculture, but it goes beyond that. So through his work, he actually explores ideas of imperialism, capitalism, and colonialism. often incorporating the color gold as a signature element in his art. His art can also be identified by his signature, Conquista. The word basically means to conquer, and Uriel chose this name to reflect the complex history of colonization. So Uriel was greatly influenced by skateboarding and hip-hop graffiti culture, which was his first introduction to the art world. During his early education, he graduated from Idea Public Schools, and he went on to pursue a higher education at the University of Houston, where he focused on painting and sculpture. He later on received his degree in fine arts in 2018. However, since 2008, his work has been featured in over 20 exhibitions, one of the most recent being at IMAS, the International Museum of Art and Science in McAllen, Texas, where the exhibition called Rompiendo el Cielo was on display during the summer of 2025. During this exhibition, it was where one of his works was displayed next to a Picasso, alongside other artists including a Banksy, Salvador Dali, and Andy Warhol. He has also produced several hundred murals throughout South Texas for small businesses, community figures, and schools. So that was just a little bit of context and an introduction to who Uriel Banderos is. And as we reflect on the book by Jeff Chang, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation, there are actually a lot of similarities between what Chang describes as graffiti writers and Uriel's approach in his early work. So based on an interview by the Rio Grande podcast, Uriel talks about the signature color that he would use often when he first began graffitiing bridges in Houston. And so his choice of color red can be interpreted as his tag, although he didn't refer it as a tag. His graffiti remained anonymous, but his close circle knew that it was him based on the color. So this is where we can see that connection that Chang describes graffiti writers would use tags. Within this podcast, Uriel expresses how to him graffiti began to feel like it didn't matter. And instead of continuing to graffiti outside, where it's most common seen, bridges, walls, he began to think about graffiti inside, specifically within a museum. This was just one of the first ideas that led him to graffiti a Picasso painting with his signature, Conquista. So I want to ask you guys, what do you guys think? Do you guys think this is controversial or revolutionary?
I think for me, it ultimately comes down to how do we define art, how policed art is, how art is used, is every act of any artist in any way, is that political by its very nature, and then therefore needs to be legislated or surveilled, or like there's all these other conversations that come up. I think red is such a bold statement to kind of say I'm here with. It's like, you know, that red rubber stamp of approval or a red pen or whatever. So I think there's definitely a boldness there in what he's doing that says I'm not going to be ignored. But I think also when you talked about his work with like Picasso's work and Dali and things like that, it puts it in conversation with those other artists. And I think that's always an interesting examination by anybody that's on the outside. And so I think a lot of people who are artists in so many ways find themselves under scrutiny. Are they revolutionaries? Like, I think you can kind of be all of the things that you described at the same time. And I think, and then in some ways when it's counterculture, then being that rebel then becomes, you know, rebel for lack of another word, like is part of that identity as well.
Right.
I honestly think that's pretty badass. Yes, in the context of like legality, sure, it's technically wrong to like graffiti a famous artist's work, but at the same time, so many artists that are revered today are done so through a lens that does not necessarily take into account the artists' identities and the identities of those who were not given a voice at the time. So I think it's really cool that Uriel sort of decided, like, he clearly knew the risk that he was taking doing this, and I think that just the boldness of that and confidence that he had within himself to be like, hey, like, oh, this is a Picasso, but like I'm also somebody and I also have something to say. I think that's really powerful. You know, and then the fact that he's from the RGB is really cool too, because it's like Jody said, puts these two works of art in conversation with one another, and sort of asks us as consumers of art, as scholars, just as people who enjoy hip hop culture and graffiti and all of these things, and art in general, to sort of reconsider what has value and what should have value.
But I think that's what's interesting to me too, is that the first time I heard about his work was in a museum space. And so often, we all know this, that museum spaces can be over legislated, they can be boxing things into like one specific way of knowing. And I think when you see that so many artists are really honestly ahead of their time and they don't have a space that makes sense, so to see it in such an established space, like I think of like Gloria Anzaldua's work and how she was so far beyond the scholarship that existed at the time, and now people know she was a genius. And I think a lot of that, you know, just kind of comes over time with, you know, then it becomes mainstream and like these cycles of things that, you know, the things that were so edgy and controversial then aren't anymore, but it really is because they were ahead of everybody else.
Right, and based off this interview, you know, Uriel expresses that he simply, and this reminded me of what you said, he simply went in there to make a statement, to make himself known. He didn't know what was going to happen afterwards. He kind of had that adrenaline rush, and he really just wanted to, you know, make a statement and say, I'm here. And that's why he graffitied over a Picasso painting, right?
Well, so many artists are not even known until after their deaths. So, I mean, there's an added layer there of, you know, I think sometimes with graffiti artists and things like that, I know we learned this in the book, that they were getting exhibitions and things like that. So the fact that he was featured at IMAS, it still puts him in this different space that isn't like, I don't know, as edgy and controversial, because at least he's in this like established space, but he's in this established space which takes him kind of out of that counterculture conversation a little bit, so it kind of complicates it, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, especially because he's taking graffiti out of, what's the word, out of its environment, you know, where it's usually seen outside, as I mentioned earlier, into a space like that.
And it's still an act of rebellion in that way. It's still rebelling against something. It's still reacting to. And
after he did this, he was offered a lot of opportunities to, you know, present his work in exhibitions. Museums wanted to work with him. So he became one of the youngest artists to have an exhibition in the Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City.
I think it's interesting that his tag symbolizes conquistadors. Like he's taking that back
and reclaiming it.
Yes, and so in these colonized, like essentialized, like European art, so often he is saying, "I was here" with his little stamp and saying, you know.
Yeah, that's to mention the painting was restored. So yeah, it no longer says Conquista on it, but
I think this is an interesting spot that brings us back to part of what we wanted to talk about today, which was how does the valley, the RGV, the Rio Grande Valley, how does it compare, contrast, relate to what was happening in the Bronx? And something that we talked about earlier was that this is such a surveilled space that yes, elements of these things that we talked about in hip hop are being watched closely, they're being monitored, they're being policed, and all of those things. But it isn't in this constant way that we find here in the Valley. So these pockets of resistance, these pockets of this kind of artistry are here, but I don't think they can form into the same like mass movement that they can in other spaces like New York. I mean, the proximity of the border just prevents, I think, most people feeling like there's one level of being like, I'm unsafe, I may get arrested, and I'm unsafe, I may get deported, that really changes that narrative a lot. Yeah. There's this other layer too of how often, how much are police or individuals in charge looking the other way. And so I think for one, yeah, that doesn't happen here, but it also, we're telling different stories that are about things like being deported. And I think also those artistic communities crop up in spaces where even if it's just underground support, they are supported. And I think it is hard to find artistic spaces to uplift in any way when everyone is under scrutiny all the time, and different things like that too. So I think that plays into it. I know I'm in a lot of artistic spaces, and we're constantly battling just the pressures of living here in this space right now.
Right.
No, I think you brought up some really good points, just about like who is present in the conversation, and like how those identities are like policed, I guess. So there were a lot of parallels that I drew in my portion of the research. So just between like hip hop and queer communities, there is a lot of disconnect, but at the same time there's a lot of similarities as well. So there's sort of like an evolution of ballroom culture, which I talk about more in my segment. But ballroom culture was sort of happening at the same time that hip hop was emerging in the Bronx.
What a crazy parallel, right?
Yeah. And I was really fascinated to learn that.
For sure.
Because you wouldn't really think that they have so much in common, but they do. And so ballroom culture is like sort of a queer underground movement, I guess. It was made more mainstream with the documentary Paris is Burning that came out, I believe, in the late 70s or early 80s. And a lot of the dances and the music and the fashion that were going on in ballroom culture also have overlap in hip hop culture. And I had done a project for another class, and there's actually a lot of connection with like drag and ballroom culture. And something that I learned recently was that RuPaul actually did a drag show here in the Valley. So like, so there's like all these like things that you wouldn't necessarily think were connected, are like these things were all happening at the same time as hip hop was emerging.
So Drag Race, RGV edition.
Yes, yes, and there have been a lot of really prominent drag artists from the Valley. I'll add in more names because I don't know them off the top of my head, but
I think this is I think something that's really interesting that doesn't come up in these kind of conversations, especially when you're talking about art and things like that, is that historically it was illegal for more than, like, say, 3 Black individuals to be together. And I don't know if there were similar laws down here. I can only assume that the laws are similar here in the Valley on, Mexican Americans gathering. But there were vagrancy laws and all of these things that basically, if you were just hanging out, like with your friends or talking or whatever, you were then scrutinized, jailed. It was an excuse to have you in jail, and then you go back to working. So like a lot of what I look at in my portion of our podcast is work songs and these other collective spaces where to be able to work effectively, people put things to song and they call for water and different things like that. So I think it too often, because our histories are not taught, we lose those kind of aspects. So the fact that, he may be one man in that space, or there may be one dancer or whatever, when they're part of these collectives, they're really scrutinized way more often. They are in danger way more often. So to be able to create an artistic community is impressive. So like that ties in, I think, a lot with what he faced here in the Valley and what he talked about.
Yeah. And one of the things he also shared in another YouTube video is that growing up here in the Valley within the education system that we have, and as he was learning about history, he said that he didn't like it. The people that looked like him were the ones getting colonized. And so that's really one of the motives behind his actions, behind his signature conquista, behind his work and what he paints and who he paints for. Well, yeah, that definitely ties into that. You know, he was seeing all of this lack of representation of his community, who he is within the school system and education.
Well, and there's a lot of performance that goes into, and I don't talk about artistic performance, but like performance in your everyday life that goes into existing in some of these spaces. So whether that's just your everyday life, you know, in spaces like he grew up in, those are colonized spaces. So that feeling of I am, you know, I've heard it so often said, I am both colonized and colonizer. And, you know, he was living, you know, we hear the term borderlands a lot, but the borderlands is not a physical space as much as it really is something that lives inside of people and that people have to navigate and negotiate and figure out, you know, whether it's code switching or just performing your identity in so many ways. And I think that comes a lot into like drag culture and some of that stuff too.
Yeah.
So something that caught my attention that William mentioned within one of his interviews that I haven't seen myself within the reading of Jeff Chang is that the reason he started to, you know, perceive graffiti as it didn't matter to him is because he considered it dangerous. You know, often, many of these times he's climbing high bridges and risking his life really. And so he said it was very common within the graffiti culture to call them heaven spots. Because if you were to fall down, you would immediately go to heaven. What do you guys think about this? At least I haven't seen something mentioned of this within the book.
As far as the book, I don't remember anything like that, but that thrill-seeking aspect of being any kind of revolutionary, I don't think we can take that out of the conversation.
Right, and he also, because I always ask myself, you know, how are people graffitiing bridges and like, you know, how do they do that? And so he basically just described that he would do it upside down. Because they asked him, did you have ropes or something? And he was like, no, you know, I would climb up and then I would be looking down and I already knew the spaces. I had taken a picture of the bridge and I would bring enough paint and then I would do it upside down, like looking down.
I saw a TV show where they were doing that and they were hanging over the center of the building. So
That's crazy.
Like I've seen that kind of illustrated and thought like, it's kind of like that Gene Kelly, Fred Astaire quote that's out there. Like she did everything that he did, but backwards in heels. That's what that's what it feels like.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's something here that kind of comes in drag culture and in a lot of artistic spaces in general, is that how often are you getting the materials and the tools to do that? Like as a child, or, you know, like some of these people I know that were doing graffiti in the 70s and 80s were teenagers and things like that. I know I've been in spaces where I want to reach other communities to be able to do art, and you look at the disparity between the supplies to do those sorts of things, or the safe spaces to do those sorts of things. And so like that thrill seeking, but there's not a safe space to even learn to do, like nobody ever taught him to be able to be Picasso. Like there was never anything in his world that probably told him, you can be Picasso, so he is something else.
Exactly. And then
A brief like video about graffiti artists who would do work on the trains, and just like kind of similar to how you said, like whether they were doing it on a bridge or just on like actual trains themselves, like there is an element of danger, and so like, are you gonna get caught? Are you gonna like it's dangerous, and to be able to do, you know, to leave your mark on something that is, as Jody said, like temporary and just kind of organic, it definitely adds another element of appreciation and just like worth, I guess, to this art form and how it shapes the culture, and
especially when stories are getting silenced and we're never told at all.
Yeah. Also from just like a technical standpoint, like I've tried to do DIY projects with a spray paint can, and it's like awful. Like I don't know how
is it not dripping?
Yes, like it just gets everywhere, and like just the precision, and like like we also talked about like the access to the tools, and now everything's so policed, you can't even go to Home Lowe's or whatever and get a can of spray paint. Like they document, you have to give them your ID, like it's so regulated now.
Yeah, it's all locked
Yes,
With
and
a
you have to
video.
you can't buy it unless you're a certain age, and then they
And
Take your
anybody that
information
watches
down.
that, is that just a Texas thing or is that an everywhere thing?
Oh yeah, I think I've only bought spray paint in Texas. I don't know, but it's just
But yeah, most of the time it's locked up.
yeah.
Because I know it's locked up here.
Oh yeah. Even if you go to Walmart. Well,
Yeah.
everything at Walmart is locked up.
Pretty soon it's just all
Yeah.
under glass.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that concludes our podcast for today. Thank you for watching. Again, my name is Alejandra.
I'm Christina.
I'm Jody.